Hello, everyone. It's really lovely to be taking part in this event this evening. Um, I think particularly nowadays, whether you're a reader or a writer, it can be difficult to believe in poetry and in the place that poetry holds in our lives and in our culture. When you're living in an age that often feels historic for all the wrong reasons, in a time of wars and pandemics, rising xenophobia, and accelerating climate change, and at a moment in history when the art of eloquence, gilded speech, can seem all too often to mask the inertia or the self-interest of powerful forces in our society. I think with all of that, poetry can sometimes seem a frivolous or even a somewhat compromised kind of activity, blithely self-satisfied as the world goes up in flames. But that is part of the reason I think why the Shark Nursery matters and why Mary's work in its entirety remains so compelling and essential. As everyone who's tuned in this evening already knows, Mary is the real deal. She's a poet whose work helps us, but also challenges us to examine our place in the world as individuals, but also, I think, as citizens, and even at a deeper, more collective level as well. Easy answers and cheap consolations are deftly dismantled in her work and sometimes ironized to make way for what is vital and complex and difficult and true in our experience, and always in poems that burn with a clarity and a quiet music that are unforgettable. And so it may be worth saying, I think, that the poise and the depth and the sometimes sardonic level gaze that we associate with Mary's writing are very much in evidence again in this collection. But not surprisingly either, these are poems that live and breathe in a contemporary world. One piece begins, bombs are falling again in Europe. The cycle of white men's rage wheels on and stamps our century with its teeth. Likewise, I think the Ireland that Mary portrays is as much a tax haven and a tourist trap, a kind of corporate playground, as it is a green Atlantic island. And of course, maybe we can discuss this, Mary, later in the evening. The long shadow of COVID-19 hangs over this collection. Mary manages to register both the eerie vividness that could accompany life under lockdown, as well as the very visceral dislocations and losses that ensued as the plague descended on all of our worlds. Um, and maybe on that note, and this is the last thing I'll mention before handing over the mic to Mary herself, I'd just like to say that as well as admiring this collection for all sorts of reasons, I was deeply moved by these poems, by their wit and humor, their political fire, their vital sense of connection and common cause with the natural world, both marine and terrestrial, and their aching, often elegiac awareness of how vulnerable our lives and our loves ultimately are, especially in the age of climate change. These are life-encompassing poems, and I'd like to think that we become more human when we read them well. So please join me in congratulating Mary on crafting such a superb new collection and in welcoming her to the stage. And as Jasmine said, if you'd like to put any questions or comments into the Q&A box, then please do so, and I'll try and field some of those over the course of the conversation later. But for now, congratulations, Mary.
Thank you very much, Kieran. And thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. I suppose I'll start and just read a couple of poems first, I think. I'll start with Asylum. And I wrote this because of just a phrase I came across, which I loved. We crave company, but nobody calls to the door. We're stuck inside with our fetters and bad dreams. Somebody somewhere is pulling the strings. The same old striptease is all the rage. They are dining with heretics on honey and nightshade. Just that phrase, dining with heretics, I stole. And the same old striptease, I believe, I think it's attributable to Sylvia Plath, if I'm not mistaken, for revealing all your inner workings and concerns and questions. And now I want to read, this poem, Lockdown or Bad, is, it's a poem I wrote in one of our many and long lockdowns, and this had been the worst one. And we were allowed to walk within, I can't remember how many kilometers, but it was the first time I was able to walk across the bridge in town. And I saw there are traditional sailing boats called the Galway hookers, and they're used for training now, for sail training in Galway, near a place called the Claddagh Basin, which is where the river enters the sea. And I saw the sail being raised for the first time. As a very small child, I remember my father had such a boat, and my second book was very involved with those boats, because I think perhaps because of them, they were my first lessons in craft. And possibly the fact that I was allowed to steer one very young, or pretend to steer it, because really I didn't know what I was doing, without anybody needing to mention that I was a girl, or girls didn't do this, which they certainly didn't at that time, probably made an unconscious difference to how I felt about being able to do things in the world. Lockdown. The long walk, I stopped on the bridge. A sail was hoisted in the sun, then another. They crisscrossed slowly, monarchs dancing. I walked on, lifted out of grief. The busker in Shop Street sang for a blind boy, and the bright levitating girl danced the passing crowds into Blake's old-style joy. All silenced, all empty. Now, between the heavy curves of the hookers, a ghost slips out of the basin, my father's glóteach, with my 7-year-old hand on the tiller, eyes ahead, steady on the mark. The keel slides down a trough, up and over in an arc clean as a knife blade, time books in the stirrups, a line of poems in the boat's wake. I watched them disappear and walked back over the bridge, past the black half-dressed beauties, shifting in their stalls. There's always something off the horse about boats, sailing boats, I think. And a glóteach is one of the classes of boat, small and quite lovely, and sea-friendly, as they say. And now for the Shark Nursery. There was a headline, the poem suggests, in one of the papers saying, "Rare shark nursery discovered off the west coast of Ireland," I think it was. But in actual fact, the shark in question is another creature altogether, who, unknown to me, though I knew these fish as a child as something that was so poorly valued that was thrown away. They're part of the shark family. Shark Nursery. I am dogfish. When I hatch, I threaten nobody. We gather in nesting places, in rock and coral. I am harmless. Thrown back by trawlermen, nobody eats me. Today, we're in the news. Scientists have observed a rare shark nursery off the west coast. Now we have status. I'm a shark suddenly, and my young, safe in their mermaids' purses, are treasure in a coral room. I am a black-mouthed cat shark now, shown some respect. That's nice, but inside, I'm still a dogfish, reviled. And metaphors, then there is a metaphor for the internet there. It occurred to me that a lot of these silent people who are, going online inventing particular types of hatred or dislike are in fact a little bit like the poor old dogfish. They get a moment of what they consider power, but they're still reviled inside. I may be very wrong about that, but it occurs to me as a possibility. And now we go to the ballad of Googletown, because really during lockdown something changed, and something which was already with us, the whole tech world and the internet became in effect all powerful. And instead of three-dimensional communication, during lockdown, certainly all communication was two-dimensional. There was a screen between us, non-sensory and two-dimensional. There was a screen between us and everybody, really, physically and otherwise. And during that period, this is what I think was complete. The poem, in actual fact, was written before lockdown, by a couple of years before lockdown, probably. But suddenly we find ourselves in this world, and I like the ballad as a form. The ballad of Googletown. The cars are in the drive, and the bees are in the hive. There are no birds in the sky in Googletown. There's no God up there on high, but the cash machines don't dry. There are hearts and flowers to buy in Googletown, Googletown. There are 2 cars in the drive, and there's 1 man left alive. He is not prepared to shrive in Googletown. There's fracking on the hill, and the camera roams at will. It's all orderly and still in Googletown, Googletown. The cars are in the drive, and the bees are in the hive. They say the kids are safe inside in Googletown, where they shop on Amazon, buying handbags by the ton, or the latest shoes or guns in Googletown, Googletown. The man is dancing out of tune, shouting, I'm the promised one, beating on a drunken drum in Googletown. He's following his own sweet light. Now he's burning fast and bright. He won't last another night in Googletown. And now we come to the singer, and I think that to some extent singing actually becomes or is coding of sorts. And this is about a very well-known Irish singer called Josie Jean-Jacques. And the lines at the end of the poem, which I'll translate, but they have to be in Irish because of their cadence and because of, was the last thing he said to me. I met him in a shop, and he was ill at that time and died not too long afterwards. And I think he left them, the last line, second last line is his, and I added the last one. And this is about the basking shark, the Leovongreina, or the sunfish in some ways. The sun leviathan would probably be more, which the bay where I grew up beside was always, every year, they used to follow the boats in during the summer, and I love them. The sharks in the bay keep their secrets from experts and tourists. They have few other predators. They guard their language. Scarce words are stolen and kept in banks. Who could afford to buy them back? The words with old-style glottal stops and the broad vowel diphthongs are gold and silver to the singer, encoded memory. Some are afraid Basque will be stolen, then it will be over. When the coast is clear, I ask if they are still composing songs. A cuach an cunas thomid's nish, they answer. A hoam gaham, gaham, goimid. We're courting silence these times, they answer, but from time to time we pray. The Marine Library is an actual library, and I visited at the request, or at the invitation of the person who was running it at the time. And it sort of occurred to me in a whimsical way as I was going in, that um, calling it the Marine Library sounded like something you would have for fish. But it's actually in the Marine Institute in Oranmore in Galway. And I've had quite a lot to do with marine ships and marine exploration, and above all, environmental marine protection for a very long time. So I was very interested to go here, see this. I called into the Marine Library to see what the fish are reading these days. Reports mostly, tedious and long. Some Conrad, no Hemingway, and a long shelf of Borges. Then there were maps, illustrated routes where shoals travelled were traced in silver for the salmon's pilgrimage way of rivers. Each map was decorated with medieval dolphins, our own small bay and blue-green mackerel wash, from which rose the curious dog-headed seals, and on the opposite wall, a vast screen where every wreck from the Arosa to the Ark at Ararat would, at the touch of a button, light up. In the children's section, tales of shark demons, mermaids lamenting their fish lovers, the saga of a strange boarding school run by electric eels. When I opened a book, I saw waves of code, blinking and fading, then rewriting themselves before breaking up with a breath of relief on some shore. Always the same lines. Songs or navigation manuals, I could not be sure. Again, this sort of notion that reading and coding and that whole connection of how, how mammals in particular, marine mammals communicate, interests me. But it's a language I don't speak, nor do I speak computer coding either, or whatever one is supposed to do with it. This was all, that was written during lockdown, although the visit obviously happened well before. But it was eerie for me, certainly. It was an eerie world. And I just became perhaps a little obsessed with realizing how little I knew about this world that I now encounter daily on Zoom. But one of the things that was wonderful for me was a site called, I think it's called the Wreck Map. It's a site of all the wrecks of all the coasts in the world that are actually registered and found. And another was the shipping site, where you can just see which boats are off your bit of coast at any given time of the day or night. This is called erasure because there was certainly a great sense of erasure. And I started looking up angels on the internet, which is a very unwise thing to do, to try and find the actual iconographies from the different religions. And this is Azrael as the boy in this. Least expected from a low sky, a man-shaped star or satellite came unwanted over the gate to the door, and hospitality demanded I be polite, serve cake and tea to his small retinue, milk to his cat. I thought I had done with stars and their emissaries, figures etched out of the scarce, dazzling. Finally he spoke. "Aye," he said, in that quiet way they have, "I'm Azrael. You're in my book, of course." And sat there, erasing names as he drank my tea, ate my cake. "Did you come to rub me out?" I asked. "Oh no," he said, "look." And I saw my own name faded like an X-ray. Your own kind are doing that. He spoke kindly, I thought. And this is the Ghost Library, which is a dream, actually, almost exactly this, but also connected to the same visit by the angel, I think. A man prepares a simple meal of bread and cheese. Another conjures up a masterpiece with lemons and dill, then sets the heavy silver on the table. Someone is walking out a door, someone is entering. Only the taste remains. When I wake, the bluebells in their grey stoneware jug pulse with electricity. Behind our eyes, night after night, a book is written, and in our waking hours erased. A library with a parade of fading lovers and troubles. Their faint scent brings to mind those we cannot see, who sometimes come to their windows to look at us briefly before we fade from their light. I think I'll read in the dark, and but maybe I live in the country, and this is about that, really. There's a fox near the house, but he rarely comes so that you can see him because he has so many places to hide, all my acre of briars mainly. But you see his tracks where he's come in the morning. The country is no place for the night walker. There are no street lamps, and chaos lunges from a ditch. Shapes lurk in the bushes. The moon is nacreous, a cold, bright stalker. You walk ahead of yourself, fearful of your demons. Even the tame ones turn in the dark, sizing you up with their eyes. Your guardian angel stays well back. When a fox barks, he whinges and edges close for protection. The feathers on his neck rise. For God's sake, you tell him, bark. Stares at him with foxy contempt. When you see the still pool, you whistle for your demons. Stay, you order. Drink. They gather and their heads dip. They are tired and thirsty. They've been with you a long time. Friendly sky is full of night animals. They mean you no harm, but only the moon can grant your wish and pull the tide across the plain up to your house on the hill. And perhaps I will read The Wandering Rocks, and that'll be it. When during or towards the end of it was after lockdown actually, I had a very bizarre incident where I woke in the middle of the night with a sort of lightning storm going off in my head, and one of my eyes then had a veil over it, for sort of weird veil over it when the lightning storm stopped. It was like a migraine, which I used to suffer from very badly, but it was a while before I could get it seen to because of the restrictions on going to outpatients. It turns out not to be not to be as drastic as it presented at all, in fact. But it gave me this poem. Maybe as a result of the sickness swamping the world, I should also say that there's a lot of Fernando Pessoa in this poem. I owe a debt to Fernando Pessoa in general, but particularly in this poem. And it always amuses me to mix him up with James Joyce because they actually looked alike, and you feel they'd have got on, but perhaps they wouldn't. Maybe as a result of the sickness swamping the world for a year, I got James Joyce's eyes. It happened in a flash. One minute I was staring at a pheasant in my column, the next at a rent receipt in Geneva and a box of unpaid bills. scores of hats for Nora. I had to bend close to the page for Circe. My sight got worse and my eyes burned, though by Paris things were looking up. I wrote home daily for details and information on Connemara, who owned such and such a field exactly, how many cows were in the small haggard, who had gone away on the Bód Bán, the immigrant boat, who died and how many were left, if any. Dear Miss Weaver, for money. Then to my aunt about the boats, who built them, and their sale plans, and dimensions. I did it all by letter from Paris, Geneva, Trieste. For the Wandering Rocks, 17 letters for their exact coordinates on June the 16th, 1904. There I stayed, out of reach of Facebook, though I Googled, tempted by the fabulous digressions, until the wake was stretching to infinity and back. Now I have my own eyes again, but in one, the left, a small island sometimes rises. I should say that one of the things that kept me going during lockdown was reading James Joyce's letters, which are, I found at least, hilarious as well as interesting. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. That was brilliant. And congratulations again on this wonderful new collection.
Thank you.
So again, you've touched on this during your reading, but I thought maybe we could start off kind of in the deep end, if you like, which is I'm conscious of the fact, for example, that when you were writing your collection, Valparaiso, a couple of years ago, you literally, as far as I'm aware, you joined a marine research team and vessel and took to the seas, as it were, for research for your book. And so, in some ways, the Shark Nursery seems to have come out of almost the exact opposite kind of experience and kind of writing routine, in that you were kind of cubbyholed and cramped into a kind of a lockdown world. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, again, you touched on this somewhat, but your experience as a writer during COVID and during lockdown, but also, again, there's a very powerful sense running through the collection when you read these poems together of the pandemic as an event in history that had social and cultural ramifications. I think you managed to balance both in a very impressive way, actually, kind of the interior and private experience and also the wide angle vision of the past couple of years. So could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, would that I could have been on the ship during
Yeah.
lockdown. First of all, just on a personal level, I find it terribly, I'm claustrophobic anyway, and socially I just found it terribly difficult. I wasn't one of the people who found lockdown liberating. I think it was directly the opposite. Normally, I write the last 5 or 6 books, certainly the last 4. They're in Paris or Spain or America. You know, I tend to work best bilocated at the very least. And so, you know, notebooks and then go away and just write. In the case of Valparaiso, I actually wrote quite a bit of the book on the ship. It was wonderful. They gave me a little table away from the pilot, from the captain, which I just hid in because to stay out of the way, and I wrote a lot of it at night. But ships are actually very social places, as you probably know if you've ever been on one. And being with a group of scientists, it was for me wonderful, which is probably why I went back to the 2 maps that would give me a feeling, the 2 sites online that would give me a sense of motion and a sense of escape and a sense of being able to get away.
Sure.
I do think the pandemic was a social event. How big, we never know with any social events until afterwards, you know. History will tell, but partly much in the way that when I mean, first of all, I went looking for plays, and I found plenty of them from, Homer's Iliad to later on, if you accept the choice that Eliot wrote The Wasteland as a result of his brain fever, which he got after the Spanish flu. I mean, certainly that, that whether it was breakdown or brain fever or whatever that
Sure.
resulted in it, there was a tenuous connection at least, and then and so on and so forth, and extraordinary descriptions and going way back to Herodotus and you know, but that only takes you so far, and I just felt that the real switch outside of the actual disease was onto the absolute switch from the verbal and the written word to spectacle, and so from personal to the screen. And you can lament that or you can praise it, but the fact is it's happened. And so there is now another made, a door had almost shut and another huge door had opened, and where it'll lead us we don't know. And I felt that it was a hinge period of time.
Sure. And that feeds into Google, the Ballad of Googletown somewhat, does
Yes,
it?
it does,
One
even
of
though that
the,
was written before, but these things don't happen overnight, as we know.
sure, yeah.
Yeah, it was sort of like a giant experiment, that period,
Mm.
both a time lapse experiment, because I'm fascinated by what it did to time, and where time was both speeded up in retrospect, but also slowed down to nothing at times. This strange, yeah, it had an eerie experimental, maybe it was experimental from the point of view of the tech giants, I'm sure it was.
Sure, yeah. On the topic of time, so obviously the collection is filled with creatures and dream animals of all descriptions, including basking sharks and foxes and rats and horses. But there was one animal that I wanted to ask you about, which is the space cat, which is the name of a poem on page 66 for anyone
Yeah, I
who has
like
the
the
book.
space cat.
Yeah. And does the space cat relate somewhat to I may mispronounce this now, is it Helgoland,
It
which is
does
the name?
anyway. Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So could you maybe talk about those two poems? Or so just to clarify, I think Helgoland is the place where Heisenberg first came up
Right.
with
Quantum.
his theory of quantum mechanics, which upturned our notions of what time and space actually
Yeah.
are. And I think you very deliberately play with that
I do,
idea, I
because it
suppose.
fascinates me. I mean, I love to think that someday I'll really understand it. I listen to Richard Feynman and read him and various others in the hopes. But and I had been given Carlo Rovelli's Helgoland, but
Helgoland,
James Joyce called it Heligoland with its one tree. So
yeah.
I used that. I used to think it might have been the island that Beckett had in Waiting for Godot, but I think
Wow.
that's attributed to something else. Just these tiny little things that we have no idea really what's causing great big changes, and also the notions of quantum reality, which is now complete in a way with the whole online world. People are, myself included probably, are inhabiting just a whole quantum worlds where they're not meeting other people, they're not having to quantum realities. We had an election recently, as you know, Kieran, and you know we had a taste of that,
Yeah.
um, where it's so easy to isolate yourself. Perhaps
Yeah.
perhaps it always has been, but in an age of communication, and that fascinates me. But I also like to think that in the end, we're not as much in control as we like to think. So the little cat.
Yeah, this is a theme that kind of runs through the book. So at one point, I love this line. I think I've mentioned it to you before. You picture a giant wind turbine on its side, like Ozymandias, which is the Shelley poem. And you also, in the Shark Nursery, which you read, you say, "Today we are in the news. Scientists have observed a rare shark nursery off the west coast. Now we have status." I think you're kind of
Yeah,
sort
it's
of in a very
interesting.
effective way. Yeah,
I'm,
sorry, go on. Yeah.
yeah, uh, you know what status is conferred and taken away, and
Yeah, I think you seem to recognize the importance of cultivating a kind of humility about ourselves, if possible, or sort of skewering some of the myths that grow up around us. Is that?
I'd love to think I was in charge of the universe. I really would love to. As a
Yeah,
kid, I think I might have sort of thought maybe that'll happen, but it would be ridiculous to any of the poets that I admire would be recognize that very quite early on in some cases. And the
yeah, yeah,
balance as a writer, I think, as a poet, is probably just how do you know that you're in control of nothing? Your time is limited. It's not even linear, actually. That's just a concept. And yet, take joy in life, and experience the miraculous when it happens.
yeah. There's
Language.
one line, I think, in the poem Holy, where you say, I promise when all this is over, I will remember what is holy. And I don't think you've had a religious conversion there. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's more that you're delving deep
You
into
know.
what is important and essential. Is that a bit closer to the truth, or?
And also the notion that there is such a thing as sacred,
Mm,
you know, the sacred things. I mean, I have things I hold sacred, you know.
yeah,
And I find children, for example, I've pretty much always loved young kids. And even, yeah, there are things that are sacred as far as I'm concerned. I'm not that cynical that I think there aren't, and I think it's important not to be intimidated into not saying that. I think that's what that poem was about. It was giving myself permission again to say, this is holy.
sure,
In
yeah.
my being.
And this may relate to, I mentioned, I'm not sure if you recognize this yourself, but to me, there seemed to be a kind of elegiac atmosphere, certainly in many of the individual poems, but kind of hovering around the collection as a whole. And I couldn't help but notice that the opening poem is dedicated to the memory of Eve Van Boland. So is there a
Yeah,
sense in which, yeah, was she, are you assuming perhaps a friend or an important figure as
she's
a
a very
writer for
close.
you?
She was wonderful to me. I mean, she took me under her wing, if you like. I started. I didn't start writing in my 30s, but I was well into my 30s before I admitted that I had to give it a go properly.
Sure. Mhm.
And I was lucky to meet Yvonne not too long after my first book, when I was writing my second book, I think. And she was just enormously generous to me all through the years. And Michael will know that she was a great, what they'd call a mentor now. But in fact, somebody who would look at my poems and comment only sometimes, very, very clearly on what might be right and wrong with them.
Sure.
She
Yeah.
did that for me, but she also inspired me a lot. She had she really believed that you could be a poet and not that you could use your intelligence within poems, as it were. And one didn't need to get the poetic didn't get in the way of the of your reason, you know. Perhaps
Sure. Yeah.
differently from me in that respect. Um, Yeah, and we weren't able to go to her funeral because of one of the lockdowns,
Of course. Yeah.
or
Yeah.
one of the, at least, restrictions, and I found that very hard.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that relates, I think throughout the book and maybe in your work in general, you have very deep delving connections to other writers and not necessarily all Anglophone writers either.
No,
Um, yeah, I know. Well, actually, maybe this would be a good point to bring in some of the questions that are coming into the Q&A chat. And Michael said that when you were reading The Ghost Library, I heard Borges alive. You have a lot of Spanish ingredients. Could you please talk about what you learned from Spanish poetry as an
oh,
Anglophone writer, perhaps
huge.
an escape
Well,
from irony?
as an Anglophone writer, alas, but I think the love of Spanish comes from my Irish speaking background, and also from Gaelic literature, because that sense of what would be called magic realism is very normal in old Irish tales and folklore.
Sure, I was going to ask you about that actually in
Yeah.
Wolf's Song, the poem for Evan Boland. I wondered whether there was a touch of magic realism in that and elsewhere in the collection as well.
Yeah, because that's how it is.
Yeah,
In a way, that's the equivalence, in my world. And I think while I might have not denied that for a while, I'm not going to anymore. lockdown was a great period of rereading, and I reread a lot of Blake and Milton and so on, as well as a lot of Neruda, Borges, some of the more, and Herbert and some of the American poets. But I think this notion of one word leaking into another, as it were,
Mm.
is very real to me. It was another way, I think, of saying that's what a lot of the visionary poets believed. I mean, I didn't actually feel the wolf, sadly, but I'd like to think he's there,
Sure.
you
Yeah.
know. And this is not about rewilding. This is just about those kind of familiars, as it were, those animals which are potent in some way. I think it varies from individual to individual.
Sure, yeah. I think sometimes there's a sense in this collection of, in order to get to the very heart of things, you sort of sidestep into a kind of dream dimension almost, and that
Yeah, I
kind of
think you
takes you
have
to
to.
what's true. I felt that when I was reading Wolf Song, anyway, the opening poem.
I think often, especially with the death, because I had a very strong reaction to Ivan's death.
Yeah.
And I had seen a video or a film footage of a wolf in California,
Wow.
an actual wolf coming into the city, and in one of the Californian cities, and I thought that really struck me at around that time.
Sure. Yeah.
I think it came from that image, actually.
Yeah. It's funny how these things kind of resurface kind of often
Yeah,
after a period of time.
yeah.
We have another question in the Q&A chat box asking, after your time on the research vessel, marine research vessel among scientists, did you feel any closer to grasping what animals might be saying about us or the mess we're making, for example?
I'm a fisherman's daughter, so I always I was very, and I still have something of that in me. I have a kind of sense of balance, and I
Sure.
don't anthropomorphize creatures, but I equally don't disrespect them. No, I didn't. I've watched whales and dolphins all my life, so
Yeah.
I hear the squeaks and I wonder how they're probably navigational to a great extent. I don't know. So I didn't have a better idea. I went straight to Paris and finished the book there after that. But it was just a wonderful experience because I got to be around scientists who knew a lot more about the richness of the life in the sea than I did. You know,
Sure. I love the moment in this book in the Marine Library, which you explained before you read it. But you say, when I opened a book, I saw waves of code. Then you say you weren't, later in the poem, you say you weren't sure whether these waves of code were songs or navigation manuals. And
yeah, you probably know that there are legends about certain tunes in the Irish tradition that they come from seals,
oh, very good.
and
Yeah. I was
the
going to
song.
say that I wondered whether poems, and particularly your poems, could be thought of as both songs and navigation manuals, as it were, navigations to living,
Yeah,
remembering.
I think they're very close. I think poetry and song are very close. They're not the same, as we know, but occasionally they coincide, as we also know from Kavanagh. That's why I love the ballads. They're fond.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You say in The Siege of Ennis, which is another musical reference, in that poem, just follow the music from a star long gone. That was a very powerful image for me anyway. But obviously music sort of stirs your creativity in all kinds of ways.
I've been lucky enough to work with some fantastic musicians over the years,
Yeah,
and um, that poem was in response to the death of yet another one of them. And the notion of just the dance is not new to me, but the notion of when one person moves out from the dance, another person moves in. That's just how it is.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I
Uh,
also think I'm just fascinated by the notion of the light from distant stars and how long ago it's been, and they're all over, and yet they're not all over because we're seeing the light. I'm not intelligent enough to say, no, no, that's gone, so it's not happening anymore.
mm,
Um, so I just find that whole uh, behavior of light and time and wave, the notion of wave dynamics, about which I should say I know nothing. But I found it quite close to poetry in many ways, close to language dynamics.
Wow. Yeah, there were moments actually when I was reading the book, when I was reminded a little bit of the late Dermot Healy's collection of Fool's Errand about the Brent geese migrating
Yeah,
to and
yeah.
from Sligo. But I think both books have, again, this very deep awareness of how the shifting seasons can color and shape people's lives without them really noticing, and also just an awareness of the vast cycles of time that we live with without really tuning into uh, very often. Whereas I think that comes across quite powerfully in your work here. But
So I mean, I'm fascinated by how dramatists deal with time, for example. I feel I can never quite get it. I know when it's right, and it really amazes me. But I just feel that I just don't think. And time in poetry, I mean, time is crucial in poetry. It's crucial in cadence. It's crucial as it is in music, in shaping a poem. At meter and time. And again, I went back to Herbert and Vaughan, whom I hadn't read for a long, long time.
mhm.
Um, just like I say, Blake and so on. I probably, unconsciously, these things were working inside me.
Yeah, and talking about Blake, this may be a slightly odd observation or mightn't make much sense, but I felt reading and actually listening to The Ballad of Googletown when you were reading it, there was a kind of visionary moment in that image of there are no birds in the sky in Googletown. To me, that was not poignant, it was almost a painful kind of image, especially given poems elsewhere in the collection like Late Swallow and Lift, I
Yeah.
think, which
Mm.
yeah, so in Lift, you picture the first swallow poised high in a clear sky. And then in Late Swallow, I think it's almost the opposite. It's would you, is there something there about the kind of
Yeah. I
re-
think I'm not. I'm married to a man who knows all about birds. I grew up with them around me, and I kind of have. I know absolutely nothing about them except where they should be at any given time. Um, but it's the absence of something, I think, that often makes it precious. That
yeah. And
I mean,
is there something as well in in Googletown, that idea of whether it's a tax haven or a tech haven or a kind of neoliberal kind of society that is kind of emptying an already kind of somewhat precarious
yeah,
natural world
I
or
think that's
disconnecting us?
happening.
Yeah.
I think that's probably influenced as much by the fact that very close to me, they're putting massive numbers of giant windmills, which are supposedly good for the planet. Apart from having great big cement platforms up on bogland on the sides of mountains and being visually quite offensive in large numbers,
Sure.
uh, they're simply there to fund Amazon data centers, not to feed into the grid at all.
Yeah.
So, there's a question of something that can, on the one hand, be used in a fantastically positive way, wind energy, but then you get what I'm talking about. Um, I think there's always the fundamental question of balance. That's what I'm trying to say, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you accept the that moniker that's sometimes thrown around of the political poet? I know it could be a little bit glib.
I
How do you
don't.
feel
I,
about
I
that?
know what you're talking about, Karen. I
Yeah.
don't. I feel like a lot of the Latin poets, and that's something I do have in common with them, and maybe and the French as well. I think that the poet is a citizen.
Yeah.
Just like you're a mother, a father, whatever, you're also a citizen. And I just, like Yeats did,
Yeah.
like Kavanagh did in a different way. So I come from that. I don't see a separation between the citizen and the poet. I don't think the poet has to write about things that are current or political.
Yeah.
And every book, I swear, I never write another poem with anything so.
Yeah, I think is there something as well in, well, you kind of exemplified it there in your references to Pessoa and Joyce and Borges or whoever it may be, that there's actually a kind of uh, I suppose, a kind of humanism to the poetic act or the
Probably more
poetic,
to the point, yeah. That's better put, actually. I think
yeah.
so. Well, there can be anyway,
Yeah.
times.
Um, well, listen, I think we're just about coming up to the end of the conversation, Mary, but I just like, if there's any more questions that people would like to put in the Q&A, please feel free to do so, or comments likewise.
Well, I'd like to just say something before we finish, which is to thank everyone at Carcanet, and I mean that sincerely. This was, for some reason, a hard book to write. Not so much to write the book as to choose what would go into it and what would stay out, because it was
Sure, yeah.
an awful lot more poems. But just to thank everybody for their continued support. It's been enormously important. The editorial input, which I particularly value. And just, yeah, Jasmine's absolutely incredible skills at doing all that she does. Just because, you know, we're not there and I'm not, it doesn't mean it's not, it's hugely valued. And I want to thank everybody. And Kieran, I want to thank you for doing this. It's very generous of you.
Oh no, it was absolutely my pleasure and privilege. I think it's a superb, absolutely essential book, not just a poetry collection. It's a book for our time. So congratulations and thank you, Mary.
Thanks very much.